Hello, I've just finished reading Night Falls Fast by a lady whose name I already forget. And by just finished reading, I mean that I actually finished it a long time ago and just haven't gotten around to making a video about it yet. Fortunately, I do have a little bit of notes, so I'll be going off of that. Um, I think in talking about my experience reading this book, there's something crucial that I'm kind of bringing to the table here, which is my motivation for reading the book. I had a new idea for a novel that I wanted to start writing that prominently features a like teen suicide, and I wanted to read some comparative literature, but also read some literature that was like not exactly academic, but like informative on the topic of suicide, right? So I came to this book already thinking about the like narrative, the stories that we like to tell about suicide, and that very much informed the way that I read this book. Ultimately, like the main thing that I got out of it is that essentially every narrative that we tell about suicide is like extremely incorrect and perhaps dangerous. So like for example, I came to the text of course thinking about 13 Reasons Why. Like I had 13 Reasons Why in the back of my head as I was reading this book on suicide. And 13 Reasons Why is absolutely replete with examples of horrible, horrible ways to represent suicide and especially teen suicide. But there, the thing is that, like, as horrible as 13 Reasons Why is in its representations of teen suicide, what this book revealed to me is that there's actually kind of a very fundamental problem in the way that we represent suicide in general in media that I think is to some extent irreducible. Like it's really common, it's nearly universal, and I think that it would be very difficult to write a story that includes suicide that doesn't like replicate some of those problems. So we're going to talk about what those issues are, right? Essentially, this book actually convinced me that the mainstream like cultural understanding of suicide is not only wrong, but is highly counterproductive, and that it contributes to, people killing themselves, which is super fucking disturbing, you know? I did not expect to come away from this book. Like, I expected to learn things about suicide, but I did not expect to come away with such a, like, strong opinion. Okay, so let's get right into it. The main claim that this book makes is surprisingly simple, and on the face of it, it doesn't sound all that controversial and it doesn't sound all that unusual. The claim is that healthy people do not commit suicide, or that they commit suicide very, very rarely. The idea basically is that if someone commits suicide, in the vast majority of cases, that is because they have struggled with mental illness, and that suicidal ideation comes from mental illness, and that the act of committing suicide is someone succumbing to suicidal ideation, that is, someone succumbing to mental illness. I think that on the face of it, this is a pretty uncontroversial claim. Like, on the face of it, it seems like an uncontroversial claim, but think about it, right? Our cultural presentations of suicide do not frame suicide as having a necessary connection to mental illness. They frame suicide as being the result of of mental anguish, right? And our media representations of suicide appeal are oriented towards the sort of like general neurotypical audience, right? And so they ask the question, in order to connect to that audience, they essentially ask the question, what would you have to go through in order for suicide to make sense? And from the like mentally sound neurotypical perspective, the idea that makes the most sense is, well, what if you went through such harrowing mental anguish that it made sense to you to end your life, that that was something that you wanted to do? And the thing is that that is not, if in the perspective of this book, which I haven't put any work into validating, right? It could be that this author has a warped perspective or something, but in the perspective of this book, that is just not how suicide works, right? Now, I really want to clarify that there is a connection between mental anguish and suicide, right? Mental anguish can be the precipitating event that leads to suicidal ideation and that makes someone who is susceptible to suicidal ideation, start thinking about killing themselves. But the crucial ingredient here is mental illness. You don't get a suicide, except for in like extremely rare circumstances. You don't get a suicide without some form of mental illness. The connection here, I think, is best understood by using an analogy to physical health, right? Like extending the metaphor of mental health by comparing this stuff to physical health. Let's say someone has a heart attack, right? They have a predisposition to heart disease, right? You wouldn't, but someone might have a predisposition to heart disease, but they also eat unhealthily, right? And they also, they exacerbate that predisposition. Okay, and they also put themselves in a situation that puts strain on their heart, right? Maybe they're an unhealthy person and they, I don't know, exercise really, really vigorously, and their heart, reaches a level where it's beating way faster than it should. And this person is maybe like 65 years old, and then they have a heart attack and die, right? Well, it would be completely unreasonable to say the cause of heart attacks is excessive exercise, right? Sure, that can be a proximal cause of heart attack. That can be an exacerbating circumstance, right? That can be the thing that actually made that person have a heart attack in that moment. But you're totally warping and just horrifically misunderstanding the picture if you leave out this predisposition to heart attacks and this otherwise poor heart health. The idea of this, the main way that this book presents suicide is that it essentially fits that model, right? Someone, because of mental health problems, because of mental illness, they might have a susceptibility to suicidal ideation and a susceptibility to suicide. And there might be and that person might live a totally happy life where this susceptibility, this predisposition to suicidal ideation is never a factor because it's just not something that's kind of triggered by their life, right? But events within someone's life can push them into suicidal ideation, right? Which ultimately can push them into suicide. So the problem here is that the mental illness component is being left out of the stories that we tell about suicide. We imagine that suicide is something that happens only because of those precipitating events. That, I don't know, being bullied at school or losing your job or just generally being miserable in life could lead anyone to commit suicide. But it's the contention of this book that is simply not true. It is an essential component that you have a predisposition to suicidal ideation. So once we've taken this claim on board, it actually makes our cultural representations of suicide not only like it's not just a pedantic point to say, oh, these representations of suicide are like incorrect. It is also counterproductive to the extent that these representations might be doing harm to the people who struggle with suicidal ideation. Unfortunately, and it's kind of like nasty to talk about, but normalizing it's the contention of the book. This is not my opinion. Like, to some extent, I'm a little uncomfortable with some of the things that are said, but the book says that normalizing suicide to some extent has negative impacts on those who struggle with suicidal ideation, right? Because when suicide is normalized, it creates a sort of self-efficacy, especially when suicide is normalized in a context where a specific set of means are discussed, right? It makes that seem like a more possible and more plausible outcome to the mind of someone who's struggling with suicidal ideation. The book claims that this is a big part of the reason that you have suicide epidemics, right? Chains of people committing suicide is because you have the details of a suicide will be reported, right? And then once people have a clear means, a clear method in mind, and they maybe know the person who did all of those things, right? Well, then it makes suicide much more like possible to the mind of someone who is considering suicide. So it's the reason that I say that this is nasty to think about, right, is because stigma, like the conclusion here that one wants to avoid, but that one kind of can't avoid, is that stigma has, to some extent, is a protective factor against suicide. In fact, this book actually answers, in a satisfying way, a question that I've kind of had for a really long time, which is why in so many cultures is there such a strong ancient prohibition against suicide, like a moral prohibition. It's not just that like you shouldn't commit suicide. It's that like, oh, if you commit suicide, we won't even have a funeral for you. We'll throw you to the dogs. You're not just going to hell, you're going to double hell, buddy. Why is this not just a thing that is attested to in the Christian religion, but that is it's a factor in other cultures as well. Why is this, something that we see in different cultures? And the answer that is suggested by this book is that it is essentially an ancient cultural adaptation that seeks to fight against the possibility of a suicide epidemic, right? The idea is that suicide epidemics are stopped by it's what is it? It's like stigmatizing suicide, right? To the extreme, suicide is stigmatized to the extreme, and that to some extent this has a protective effect on people who are struggling with suicidal ideation. Um, and also, it has a retarding effect on suicide epidemics. That's the idea. And that, of course, comes at the horrific cost of, like, demonizing the people who actually then do succumb to suicidal ideation. This kind of connects to another big theme in the book that I found really interesting, which is that there are clearly aesthetic concerns in the mind of someone struggling with suicidal ideation. There are some sections of this book that basically just talk about means that people use to commit suicide and suicide notes and stuff like that. There's like the book is like a mix of here's what the research says, and also I feel kind of uncomfortable with it, but kind of like rubbernecking at like suicide as a phenomena and just being like it has very like true crime vibes to be like, here's some like really messed up ways that people have chosen to kill themselves. And then there's also a chapter on suicide notes where we like read some of the suicide notes. I'll get into that in a second. But anyway, there are aesthetic considerations, and aesthetic considerations unfortunately play a pretty major role, right? People choose means that have some kind of often they choose means, locations, stuff like that that have some kind of meaning to them. And it is suggested by the book that if someone does not have access to means that are aesthetically pleasing to them, not necessarily that the means themselves are pleasing, but that they fulfill some sort of aesthetic requirement, right? If they don't have means that fulfill some sort of aesthetic requirement in the mind of someone struggling with suicidal ideation, then people often will just not commit suicide. And this is not universal. So she suggests that there are some people who want to die so badly that these like protective factors that she talks about just don't matter, right? People who no amount of stigma is going to stop them from killing themselves, and they will use any means at their disposal. And it's really, really hard to like completely take away someone's means of ending their life, right? And she uses some examples of ways that people have killed themselves that you would really not pick. They would not be in my top 1,000 choices, right? And she uses that as an example to say that, look, sometimes people want to kill themselves so badly that they're willing to pay any cost to do that. But this is not the majority of cases. In fact, this is a very, very slim minority of cases. It seems that people who are suicidal do not seek out suicide at any cost. And having means available to them that are, fulfill this mysterious aesthetic quality and also that are, convenient and potentially painless is something that exacerbates the risk of suicide. I think most people know that if you own a gun, the person that you're most likely to use it against is yourself. And that is an example of this, right? If you have means that are convenient and potentially painless, i.e., a gun, then you're much more likely to succumb to suicidal ideation. But there's also this aesthetic quality. She gives an example that I find really tantalizing and compelling, and she doesn't really fully unpack it. And the example is people who survive jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. When they're interviewed afterwards, most of them seem to suggest that to their mind, in their mind, they were either going to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge and kill themselves, or they were not going to kill themselves. It was not a situation for most of these survivors where they were going to do it no matter what, right? It's more so that a specific means kind of worms its way into their mind as this is how I want to kill myself. And if they didn't have access to those means, or if that set of means did not like occur to them, the book kind of suggests that perhaps these people wouldn't have killed themselves. So part of the protective factor, there's two things here. Part of the protective factor of these like weird laws is that they take away the aesthetic appeal of suicide in general, right? We're not going to give you a funeral. We're going to let the dogs chew up your body. You're going to be carrion. um, it sort of ruins any aesthetic appeal that the suicide might have, right? So that's a part of these ancient prohibitions. The other thing is that for in modern times, it's important to be cognizant of these factors, right? It's important to be cognizant of the way that a certain landmark or a certain dangerous environment might kind of call to someone as a way to end their life, and to, do things to avoid that happening. So for example, the Golden Gate Bridge now has nets on it, right? It's much more difficult to kill yourself by jumping off of the Golden Gate Bridge, and the overall incidence of suicide by that means has reduced. The other thing is, it's not it's not really like an all or nothing thing, right? Like adding impediments that make it harder or make it less like uh God, I feel so uncomfortable with these terms, but that make it less like aesthetically pleasing to kill yourself with a particular means, can reduce the incidence of suicide using, like by jumping off a certain bridge or something, without necessarily making it like physically impossible to do so, right? Okay, so those are the aesthetic considerations. They're interesting. Um, Suicide notes. Found I found this part to be a little yucky, but also really interesting. Like I said, it sort of has true crime vibes to it. She talks a lot about suicide notes. First of all, the majority of people do not leave a note. Most people who commit suicide do not leave a note. Um, the There's something that I find really like disturbing on many levels about suicide notes, which is that most of them are technical pieces of writing. They are not concerned with, you know, aspects of the human experience or an explanation of why, and like they do not, for the most part, seek to like penetrate into the recesses of the human experience that led someone to the point of wanting to take their life. They are, for the most part, technical. The number one topic that comes up in suicide notes is what to do with my body. That is what people write about when they write suicide notes, for the most part. The next most common topic, I think, is what to do with my stuff. It's concerns about what's going to happen to my body, what is going to happen to essentially the scene of the suicide. Um, it's information that is necessary to the people discovering the body. For example, if someone kills themselves using gas, they might leave a note that says like, "Hey, there's like gas in this room." And then it is, uh, and then only after all of those things do people write about the reasons, right? The things that led them to this, or any sort of, or provide any sort of like insight into the suicidal experience. And I found this really surprising, but I also immediately afterwards found it kind of surprising that I would find this surprising, right? Depression and suicidal ideation, they strip people of all of the things that make the human experience appealing, you know? And so why would someone, when they're like at the height of those emotions, why would they use that? Why would they take that moment to like write something that like penetrates into their own experience like that? It just doesn't make sense that the majority of notes would be like that, and in fact they are not. Oh, what a topic, God. Yeah, now that I'm making this video, I can see why I really like put it off. Okay, so the last topic to talk about here is suicide prevention. A lot of the stuff that a lot of the cultural narratives. Actually, no, I want to talk about something else first. I want to talk about the narrativizability of suicide. So I came into this because I want to write a story that includes suicide as a significant element, right? And the problem that I've run into is that, to some extent, suicide as it actually exists is difficult to narrativize, right? Now, to some extent, it's okay if certain things are difficult to narrativize, right? Like, it's okay for something to exist in literature in a way that is different and more exciting than the way that it exists in real life. The problem is that many of the like shortcuts and hacks that we use to narrativize suicide have really horrible effects on people who are actually experiencing suicidal ideation. So I'm no longer certain that I'm going to actually write this novel that I've been thinking about, but if I do, I feel that there is a great responsibility on my part to represent suicide in a way that is first and foremost not going to hurt anyone, and second, that is accurate, you know? So like I don't want to write a book that's gonna make someone's experience that's gonna like make someone die. So so I don't know. And it seems like if you want to write about suicide in a way that is accurate and make some that isn't going to like hurt people, you kind of can't write about it in a way that is very exciting, right? Because I think part of the reason that we gravitate towards the suffering that sometimes precipitates suicidal ideation is because there's a narrative there, right? There's a narrative arc that makes sense and that you know you can make a story out of. Whereas if you focus on the what I have now come to believe are the more important elements, which is mental illness, then well, it's just not as interesting, you know? Like, okay, 13 Reasons Why. Haven't read the book. I guess I probably will at some point if I decide that that I'm gonna write this book, I'm gonna have to read 13 Reasons Why. Think real hard about why it sucks. But 13 Reasons Why presents an otherwise healthy teenager who then goes through some really horrible shit and is like, I want to die. Her decision to die is a, like, one that she makes seemingly, at least in the uh, show, makes in her, like, right mind. It's a rational decision. She decides it, basically, right? And then she kills herself. And that number one is an inaccurate way of representing suicide, and number two, to the people that are struggling with suicide, seeing that represented to them would make them more likely to harm themselves. So that's fucking nasty, right? Okay, yeah, the narrativizability of suicide is a big issue. I don't know, I'm just gonna be thinking about that one. Okay, the last topic is suicide prevention, right? These cultural messages that we have about suicide, I would here's a fun term for you, the neurotypical understanding of suicidal ideation, the neurotypical intuitions about suicidal ideation are deeply harmful to those people who actually do struggle with suicidal ideation. When people are told that suicidal ideation is the product of suffering, the direct product of suffering, it makes them feel like suicidal ideation, that suicide is a response to their suffering, right? Whereas it is much better to understand suicidal ideation as a product of mental illness that is sometimes precipitated by life events, right? That is a framework that the author at least believes is much more likely to lead to improved outcomes, meaning people not killing themselves. So she does cite some evidence. I forget all of the details, but she talks about this research that was done into an intervention in a high school, where basically teens were given a speech, and there was an interview that was basically like low key, like, "Are you going to kill yourself? Yes or no?" And teens who had the intervention, which was based on this like commonsensical understanding, the neurotypical intuition of suicide, which is you suffer and then you decide to kill yourself. Teens who were given, like, suicide comes from bullying. Teens who were given that messaging rated themselves as more likely to commit suicide than the teens who had received no messaging whatsoever, right? So clearly, the neurotypical intuitions about suicidal ideation are not actually like helpful. If anything, they're a narrative that the neurotypicals tell to themselves and tell to the broader culture to make themselves understand suicide in a way that is more like comforting to them. And hey, that's fucking nasty. Okay, so what is the messaging that is going to actually help people? Well, I've been fucking harping on it for this whole video, right? Which is that suicide is the product of mental illness. Suicidal ideation is the product of mental illness, sometimes precipitated by life events. The last thing is that the portrayal of methods is really, really, really bad. When news reports talk about the way that a person killed themselves, it makes it much more likely that people are going to use that method of killing themselves, right? This is another problem for representing suicide in art, right? Because you know, one of the best pieces of the most generally useful pieces of advice in art is show don't tell, right? You want to be as concrete with things as you can, you want to be as visceral with things as you can, but when it comes to suicide, that is risky. If you present a specific method on screen, you will make certain members of your audience consider using that method on themselves. And, that's fucking not good. So anyway, portrayal of methods is really bad. I've gone through my whole list. I feel so tense right now just thinking about this stuff. Man, this video probably sucked to watch, huh? Well, this book sucked to read, it sucked to think about, this video sucked to make. I hope you feel as bad as I do. But I also hope that you have learned one or two things about the representation of suicide and blah blah blah, etc., etc. Okay, video's over. Bye bye.